Bona tarda de nou. Recomencem la sessió de tarda, la segona sessió d'aquesta tarda, la quarta sessió del bloc aquest de la transformació global i tal. I el nom d'aquesta sessió és el futur de les armes nuclears, oportunitats i reptes al context geopolític actual. Bé, en el canvi aquest una mica de món que tenim, en el món anterior la dissuasió nuclear era un element fonamental. Llavors, en el canvi aquest es tracta de veure una mica quin serà el paper dels diferents actors nuclears en el nou canvi que sembla que es pronuncia. I aquest és el tema que ens parlarà la Susi Snyder. La Susi Snyder és directora de programes de la Campanya Internacional per l'Evolució de les Armes Nuclears, ICAN, que és l'organització que va guanyar el Premi Nobel de la Pau el 2017. És experta en armes nuclears, amb més de 2 dècades d'experiència en la intersecció entre la política nuclear i els drets humans. És membre de la Foreign Policy Interrupted Bard College de l'any 2020 i ha estat guardonada amb el Premi Nuclear Free Future del 2016. Anteriorment va treballar en PACs en l'àmbit de desenvolupament humanitari i va ocupar el càrrec de secretària general de la Lliga Internacional de Dones per la Pau i la Llibertat en la seva secretaria de Ginebra. Ella, a més, és nascuda a Alemanya, ha viscut molt de temps a Nova York, ara viu a Utrecht, és una noia molt internacional i, a més, ella es defineix bàsicament com a mare, companya i, fierce feminist. Fierce feminist vol dir feminista fervent. Això és la seva definició a Twitter, que jo crec que és molt interessant, a part de les coses d'altre tipus. Doncs res més, li cedeixo la paraula a la Susi i, com sempre, després tindrem temps per fer preguntes i res, i fins ara. Moltes gràcies. Thank you, Susi, for your presence here and yours.
And so I will begin. It's very nice to be here with you all. Thank you very much for spending your Friday afternoon with us. It's really very cool to be here, even if the temperature is very warm. I'm going to do a couple of things today. I'm going to talk a little bit about nuclear weapons and the situation in the world with nuclear weapons, but I thought I might also do a little experiment and challenge you to think about nuclear weapons maybe in a different way, and maybe think about why we think about nuclear weapons in the way that, honestly, most of us do when we think about them at all. And that's not everyone that thinks about nuclear weapons all the time. I do, but I can be boring about it. I'll try not to be boring. Let's see. Okay. Hey, my friend's going to help. Oh yeah, turning it on. See? Technology, this is a thing. So nuclear weapons require a lot of technology, right? And as you can see, we can't guarantee that technology works. As that's getting off, I'll just keep talking. Let's talk about nuclear weapons and what the situation around nuclear weapons means. So at the beginning of this year, we counted how many nuclear weapons there are, because that's always a good thing to start with, right? Let's see how many there are in the world. And there are a little more than 12,000 in arsenals, and they're only in the arsenals of 9 countries. And so I always want to start off saying this, because Iran does not have nuclear weapons. So just to make that clear, people always ask. And of those 12,000 nuclear weapons that there are in the world, not all of them are ready to be used, right? It's actually less than 10,000 that are available for use. But the ones that are available for use, the ones that are on submarines circling the globe at every moment, the ones that sit in silos across the American Midwest, those nuclear weapons, the ones that could be launched at any minute, that are in the hands of 9 men, they have a combined explosive power of more than 135,000 Hiroshima bombs. That's a lot of firepower. And it is, as I said, it's consolidated in the hands of 9 countries, 9 men who have this control over these weapons. But they're not alone, all right? There are 33 other countries that support the possible use of nuclear weapons, that have them in their security policies. Spain is one of those countries that has nuclear weapons in its security policies. And a growing number of these countries, these 33, are becoming much more directly involved in the nuclear strike exercises and conventional support for nuclear operations. They're getting involved in the planning and preparation to drop nuclear bombs. But this is not the situation in the whole world. And actually, we noticed a trend. There is a global divide. And there's a treaty, the Prohibition on Nuclear Weapons, and so we looked at support for that treaty. Overwhelmingly, in Latin America, South America, and Africa, there's tremendous support for the nuclear ban. And the resistance is in Europe. That's okay. Europe is the problem with nuclear weapons. So, a lot of the time, we hear about China, and China as the justification for why the US, in particular, is getting more nuclear bombs. So I just want to explain. China has increased its number of nuclear weapons, but when it comes to how many of them are ready for use at a moment's notice, we estimate 24. They have about 600, but they're not ready. They're not armed. They're not ready to go at a moment's notice. But they have increased the number of overall weapons in the arsenal, right? And they're at now about 600, and they continue to increase the number. The United States, the US security establishment says that China's increase in numbers, total numbers, not deployed numbers, is a justification for planning to spend more than $1 trillion on its own nuclear weapon system over the course of the next couple of decades. Now, these Chinese nuclear weapons, the ones on submarines, they can't actually even target the US from where they operate. It's a false justification. And I'm going to come back to this idea around false justifications for nuclear weapons. But I want to talk about something closer to home. I want to talk about France for a second, because France made some big changes this year. In fact, in March, Emmanuel Macron issued a new nuclear doctrine for France, where for the first time in decades, France is increasing the role of nuclear weapons. France is planning to build more nuclear weapons than it has ever had before, and it is partnering with other countries across Europe to deploy nuclear-capable airplanes. It's about 10 countries that France is having these conversations with. The details are very secret. In fact, they are different when press has questioned the government of France and the press has questioned the government of, for example, Sweden. Sweden and France are giving different answers about the same agreements. Nobody knows what's actually happening here. And it's part of the problem, and it makes things much riskier. There was also a new declaration between France and Germany. And if you like history, and I'm quite fond of history, the idea of France and Germany having a cooperative security declaration involving weapons designed to end civilization as we know it is shocking. And in fact, I sometimes wonder if I'm watching science fiction or the news. But they actually issued a new declaration in March of this year in which Germany will participate in French nuclear exercises. And this is adding to a risk, and it's a growing risk that we're facing around the world. Because when these exercises take place, we don't know, are they nuclear, are they not nuclear? And our adversary, those who we may be in conflict with, they don't know. When countries say they will no longer share this information, it increases the risk and it decreases the predictability. And nuclear deterrence requires both predictability and stability to work. So this is increasing risk everywhere. The other thing that France did in March of this year is they said they might use nuclear weapons as a so-called warning. And this is a demonstration that they have forgotten what nuclear weapons do. They have forgotten that when France detonated nuclear weapons in the Pacific, over the course of the next 20 years, children were born without bones in their bodies. France has forgotten, and so have many of us, about what nuclear weapons do. And the more that we talk about them as possibly useful, the more we increase the risk. And that's something I'm very, very, very concerned about, because there is no way you could ever use a nuclear weapon and still be within the bounds of international humanitarian law. There just isn't a way to do it. Now, I talked about these 9 countries that have these bombs, and I'm involved in, we publish a research report every year on what does this actually cost. Because I like to think about things in the terms of numbers. I like to think about what it means for me. And we found last year that these 9 countries spent about $120 billion on their nuclear weapons. In fact, they increased their spending by about 20% over what they spent in 2024. And overwhelmingly, it's the United States that spends the most. In fact, the United States spent more than all of the other nuclear-armed countries combined. They spent $69 billion last year on nuclear weapons. My family lives in the United States. My family is watching bridges not being functional, roads that can't be driven on, schools that have no money, and a collapse of national infrastructure. But somehow, the money was there to spend on nuclear weapons. China's also spending a lot more, and as I said, they're increasing their arsenals. But so is Pakistan. So is the United Kingdom. In fact, the United Kingdom, Britain, increased its spending by 17% last year. And just last week, they announced a new defense spending budget, and the numbers are going up. Now, those numbers can be really hard to think about. Like, I will never in my life see $1 billion. In fact, I will probably never see $1 million, right? I just don't get these numbers. So, let me break it down a little bit differently. If you figured out what these countries spent for every single person living on the planet last year, it was $12. Now, we often talk about a race to end massive poverty, and poverty is defined as living on less than $2 a day. But these countries could spend $12 for every human being on the planet. And this year in particular, there's been a massive crisis in the United Nations. How are we going to pay for the UN? What's going to happen to the UN? That's okay. Oh, cool. Thanks. Well, I'll tell you, if we took the money spent on nuclear weapons, we could pay for 32 years of the United Nations in 1 year of nuclear weapons spending. It's a lot of money. And let's talk about what these weapons actually do. right? Because people forget what they're out there for. People have forgotten what they are capable of. So let me remind you. This is a picture of the man who maybe got me involved in this issue, or at least got me to commit the last almost 30 years of my life to it. His name is Sumiteru Taniguchi, and he's called the postman of Nagasaki. Now, he's passed away some years ago. He was 16 years old when the Americans dropped a nuclear bomb on Nagasaki. And he was a postman, so he's riding his bicycle around Nagasaki delivering the mail, because even in wartime, you deliver mail. And the bomb, he was about 3.5 kilometers from the epicenter of the bomb. And as you can see, it burned his back. In fact, it burned it so bad that he spent months lying on his chest. And I was in a conference room almost exactly like this one. And I was standing in a corner like that over there when he was speaking at a table just like this. And at the end of his talk, this very, very, stately looking gentleman, at the end of his talk, he lifted his shirt and you could see his heart beating, because spending so much time recovering from those burns had forced the bones of his chest to cave. And so you could see his heartbeat. And I, standing across in the back of the room, thought, okay, this is insane that somebody would live through this, that somebody would have the courage to tell this story over and over and over again, that they would bare their chest to the world to make sure it never happened again. And I thought, well, for me, that was a moment where I said, I have to do something about this. And this is one of the things I'm doing, is sitting here with you all. But I'm talking to you also about what nuclear weapons themselves do. Because the first thing is to talk about is the heat that caused these burns. And when a nuclear weapon is detonated, the heat it releases is extreme. In fact, the fireball it generates is estimated to reach about 1 million degrees centigrade at its core. And that fireball rises high into the sky while ground temperatures reach several thousand degrees, hotter than the surface of the sun. Now that extreme heat starts fires, and those fires actually race through a very wide area. And as we all know what happens in fires, because the world is suffering from many of them all over right now, toxic smoke and combustion gases, they burn up and they create this toxic cloud that people who manage to survive, they breathe. But even more than that, it travels on the air, it travels on the wind to destinations far away from that site of the fire itself. But people who are tens of kilometers away from where a nuclear bomb goes off, they'll also be impacted. And they may not be impacted directly by the heat, but they'll see in the distance a blinding flash. And we estimated what would happen if a bomb were to go off in the port of Rotterdam. And that blinding flash would cause traffic accidents that would shut down and prevent emergency services from being able to reach the center of the disaster and prevent any help from coming. And I know everybody here has sat in traffic at least once, so you can imagine what that's like. The other thing that nuclear bombs do, is they create this blast. And that's a fast-moving wall of high-pressure air. It's a shock wave, and it moves outwards for many kilometers. And the pressure in it is so high, it hurls people through the air. It picks up vehicles and throws them through the air. It can cause bodies to be torn apart. It causes lungs to collapse and buildings to be flattened. The flattening of buildings will crush people to death. Like things that are loose objects, they'll be thrown and they'll hit others or other infrastructure. One of the unique things about nuclear weapons is the radiation. And it's the nuclear chain reaction that causes the initial explosion. It's why a nuclear weapon is different from a conventional weapon, because it has this chain reaction. And that releases a massive amount of ionizing radiation. And radiation is the tricky devil. It penetrates deep into your body, it destroys and damages cells, and even at a distance of several kilometers from the site of impact, people can receive a dose of radiation high enough to poison them. And most times when that happens, the sufferers die within a couple of months, but some recover. And then it comes back years later, or even generations later, in the birth defects that happen, or the chromosomal aberrations, or other genetic damage. Sometimes it passes on to their next generation. And we're seeing now, as a result of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the testing of nuclear weapons in the Pacific, Australia, Kazakhstan, and other places, even the third generation is suffering from these bombs. But radiation is not the only thing either. The fallout happens from a nuclear weapon, and the fallout is what we see when we think about nuclear weapons a lot, and I'll come back to that. But the thing is, like, the blast is so intense, and the heat is so intense, it creates this massive pressure, right? And the heat in the fireball is so strong, it burns the oxygen, and it creates a vacuum. And that's what sucks up the dust and the debris, and it creates this mushroom cloud that we see that travels so far away. And then it rains down. And where it lands is completely unpredictable, because if you can predict the wind and the weather accurately in every moment after a catastrophic event like this, you're rare. And there's a lot of news companies that would like to hire you for their weather. So fallout is a key thing and a key impact of nuclear weapons. And finally, I want to talk to you about something that is not talked about very much and has been researched very poorly, and that has huge effects on our lives today. And that's called the EMP, the electromagnetic pulse. Because if you detonate a nuclear weapon at a high altitude, it emits this powerful electromagnetic pulse, and that destroys electronics over a wide area. Things like cellular communications, things like internet capabilities, things like banking. All of this will be severely disrupted. And it was first observed, these effects, during the era of atmospheric and high altitude nuclear testing in the 1950s. And in 1962, the US tested a nuclear weapon in outer space, and it was above the Johnson Atoll in the Pacific Ocean. That caused damage to streetlights and phone systems in Hawaii, 1,500 kilometers away. Right? So there is no way to localize these impacts. What we do know is that they will affect people everywhere. And it's really important to think about. We have to know what these weapons do, and we have to talk about what these weapons do. Now, I want to ask you to think just for a second. Maybe close your eyes and think about, what do you see in your mind when you think of the words nuclear weapon? Do you see a mushroom cloud? Do you see a missile pointing away from you? Do you see a military command room filled with very serious-looking men? Do you see a map with red blast circles? People often see the same things. Let's talk a little bit about why. One of the great thinkers about photography, Susan Sontag, wrote that images cannot create a moral position, but they can reinforce one, and they can help build a new one. And she was right. But I'll go further, because in the case of nuclear weapons, images don't just reinforce a position. They make certain positions feel like common sense, and others feel completely naive. And we look at research, and in the work to challenge nuclear weapon policies, we look across many areas and many disciplines. And we've seen research that shows when visual and verbal information conflict, we trust the visual, we trust our eyes over our ears. We believe what we see. That's what humans do. It's a feature of our anatomy. It's a feature of our thinking. But what it also means is that whoever controls the images of nuclear weapons has enormous power over how we think about them. And right now, that power is concentrated in a small number of hands. Because nuclear weapons imagery is largely produced and filtered by the defense establishments in the nuclear-armed states. And the picture is incomplete. The dominant images around nuclear weapons, they show power. They do not show suffering. They show hardware. They do not show humanity. And they show control, but they do not show catastrophe. Now, there are 8 dominant myths that we've identified about how what we see influences how we think, especially when it comes to nuclear weapons. Things like the danger is abstract. The bomb itself is when the story ends. Nothing happens afterwards. That nuclear weapons protect us. That nuclear weapons are just kind of out there. That only the responsible countries can have them. That if you question this, it's worthless. That experts all agree about all of these things. And that if you resist, it's rather futile. But the perpetuation of these myths around nuclear weapons serves an interest, a very clear interest. It's an interest that is earning money off that $120 billion spent on nuclear weapons last year. And they keep us distracted, and they keep us feeling powerless. I'm going to quickly run through a couple of images because I know that time is moving quickly. So let's think about the dominant myth, that the danger is abstract. You don't see the danger, you see the response to the danger. What you don't see is the reality that nuclear weapons are made in a place that they have, when they are built, they impact the local community. In fact, communities surrounding nuclear weapons production are sick because of the building of these nuclear weapons. And we see this with other defense technology as well. What we see here on the right is a former nuclear weapons assembly site. And people there were contaminated with uranium milling waste. And they closed this elementary school because the children were too sick. They couldn't continue going there. But the US government refuses to acknowledge this anymore and refuses to compensate the community. So we see the image of the weapons, but we don't see how it came about. Let's look at another one, the mushroom cloud. This is probably the most reproduced image of nuclear weapons that's out there. It's what most of us think about. It's what I think about when I close my eyes and I think about these weapons. You can buy these posters on Amazon. They're oddly popular. And what it does is it makes a nuclear explosion look like the end of the story, because we see above the mushroom cloud. We see to the side of the mushroom cloud, but what we don't see is the lived reality under the mushroom cloud. We don't see Sumitomo Taniguchi. We don't see the people who did miraculously survive the bombings of nuclear weapons. Let's go for another one. We see nuclear weapons represented as bombs, and they're never pointed at us. They're always pointed away from us, because it gives you this idea and it triggers a feeling of a shield, of a protector. It sends the message, it will keep you safe. But in 2018, the people of Hawaii got an emergency alert on their telephone saying that there was an inbound ballistic missile, and it was not a drill. They had 15 minutes before impact. There was massive panic. People were hiding in their bathtubs. Mothers had to make the decision. Which of my children, which school do I go to? Do I pick up the little one or the one in high school? Who can I say goodbye to? It was a false alarm. That is not a feeling of protection. That is not this idea that we see when we think about nuclear weapons. That takes away from this concept of a shield and goes to the reality. Go here. We also see that the idea of disarmament, the idea of diplomacy, is hopeless. We see empty chairs in the UN, or we see a few people, but not everyone who might be engaged in the conversation. Here, on the left, we see this silent consensus. This idea that, everybody's fine with this issue of nuclear weapons. But on the right, we see a reality that, in fact, governments, more than 130 governments, came together to negotiate the end of nuclear weapons, to negotiate a ban on nuclear weapons. That's the reality, and it's something that's not usually considered in nuclear disarmament, or in nuclear disarmament imagery and nuclear weapons imagery. We can call this the weapons of mass perception, because it's actually been an effort to condition us to think that it is okay, to think that these bombs that are designed to cause mass murder are acceptable, that they're normal. But nuclear deterrence, the theory, or a theory requires proofs, the hypothesis underneath the production of nuclear weapons relies on the preparedness to kill millions of people within a moment. And it requires you to understand what your adversary is thinking all the time. And it requires you to trust that they understand what you are thinking, that they can read your signals and you can read their signals. Nuclear deterrence in NATO means that we trust Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping to never use nuclear weapons. It's not a policy that can withstand a lot of questioning or a lot of scrutiny. It starts to fall apart really quickly. And let's talk about why. Because this is where there's a really interesting piece of academic work that I came across earlier this year. And it really started to pick apart this image. Why do we trust the idea of nuclear weapons? Why do we trust the idea of nuclear deterrence? And it started with this idea of a new person that appeared in American political life. It was in the 1950s, and they called themselves strategic analysts or defense intellectuals. The historian Fred Kaplan called them, and I'm not making this up, he actively called them the Wizards of Armageddon. And they were mostly civilians. They were economists, mathematicians, political scientists. They were not military men. They worked at a place called the Rand Corporation. It was funded by the US Air Force, but staffed by academics with security clearances. None of these people had ever fought in a war. Most of them had never actively seen a nuclear bomb. But somehow, they became the undisputed authorities on how nuclear weapons should be used. And their answer was, threaten with them. Now there's 3 features in these magicians, right? There's this political scientist, Thomas Fraze, published a paper asking about what people learned from them and why. Because their methods were never really contested. Their predictions could not possibly be verified. So how did they get this authority? And he called them magicians. He coined this idea of these nuclear magicians. And they were not literally magicians. They didn't have magic wands or capes. But they have features that anthropologists associate with magical practitioners across cultures. And the first is liminality. So they exist in this sort of threshold space between academia and government, between the visible world and the hidden world of classified information. But they were not fully in either one. And as we all know, like in many cultures, those who live on the margins, they're imbued with this sense of sort of special powers. Those who manage to go between worlds, they're seen as special. They're gifted with that. The second thing is that their craft work was rather esoteric, right? So they had these methods people didn't understand or engage in themselves, systems analysis, game theory. And they were presented as highly technical and accessible only to the initiated. So either you spoke their language or you didn't. And if you didn't speak the language, and this happens with all of us, you tend to sort of defer. You say, oh, well, you're using these words and I don't quite understand what they mean, so you must be right. Like, that's human nature, we all do that. The language itself that they built was a form of power. And the third thing is the secrecy. Everything was classified. Most of their work was never published. And secrecy, as another anthropologist, Tanya Luhrmann, argues, it doesn't just protect information, it creates awe. We defer to secret knowledge because we can't evaluate it. We trust the person saying, this is classified knowledge, this is classified information, and you can't know it. We trust that it's right. Whether or not it is, we don't have the chance to access that. But when you put all these things together, these magical principles together, you have the conditions for what Thomas Fraze calls ritualized knowledge production. And it's knowledge that derives its authority not from being right, but from being performed in the right way, by the right people, with the right mystique. And this is where it starts to get a little bit uncomfortable, because his theory, this Thomas Fraze's core theory, is that deterrence theory is not a theory, it's magic. And it's a magic script. And a script is a set of practices that are linked to expected outcomes, right? And so a magic script is one where the connection between cause and effect cannot be verified. It can only be evaluated against the script itself. So you can never actually see if it's right or if it's true. How do we know nuclear deterrence works? Well, a lot of people say it's because we have not had a nuclear war. Can I tell you something else? The European Union was crafted, and we haven't had a nuclear war. Is the European Union the answer? Or the internet? The internet was invented. Does the internet deter nuclear war? Both of these things may be true, but we don't know because you can't ever actually prove it. And the absence of nuclear war does not inform us as to why there has been no nuclear war. And this is troubling, because deterrence is this system where you threaten to do something so catastrophic that you sincerely hope you never have to do it. And you rely on your opponent understanding that you're serious enough that they won't call your bluff, while also hoping they're rational enough not to make a catastrophic mistake, but also not so rational that they'd figure out you'd never actually follow through. It goes in circles, over and over. And again, another anthropologist, Malinowski, he wrote that magic appears whenever there is danger, uncertainty, and inadequate knowledge. And nuclear weapons combine all three of these things in their purest form. No one, thankfully, has ever fought a nuclear war. We cannot experiment with it. And the stakes of being wrong are actually civilization ending. So it becomes magic, because what else could it become? And this is why the imagery matters. This is why the myths matter, because the magic script requires people to protect it. People who claim the right to interpret it, maintain it, and exclude others from the conversation. It's called guardianship. And in democratic states, the democratic oversight around nuclear weapons has been removed because of the successful and repeated application of this magical script. And the practical consequences mean that people don't or feel they can't engage in this question. And dissent with the idea of nuclear weapons is framed as naivete. And democratic accountability is suspended. And it's because the guardians say so. So I have been told many times that I just don't understand deterrence. And people will also say this to you if you talk about nuclear weapons and social situations. You just don't understand. But I want you to remember something. Those initial wizards of Armageddon, they didn't understand it either. They never tested it. They did not apply rigorous scientific principles to crafting this hypothesis. It's not even a theory. So, what does this mean? How do we break the spell? What do we do about this issue? In our campaign, we made a deliberate choice. Don't fight on the old terrain. Don't argue about deterrent stability or second strike capabilities or escalation ladders. I can talk about all of that stuff. I can tell you what will happen when and how. I can name the names of those who build nuclear bombs, and I can put the corporate logos on the side of those missiles. But if we argue in that space, we're on the magician's home turf. And as we all know, if you're playing an away game, you're more likely to lose. It's better to bring people and play them at your home turf. And we decided to change the framework entirely, to ask different questions. Not does deterrence work, but rather what happens when nuclear weapons are used. Not which states are responsible, but who suffers in this if nuclear weapons are going to be used. This is what we called the humanitarian initiative, centering the discourse on the bodies, on the communities, on the long-term consequences, never forgetting people like the postman of Nagasaki when we talk about nuclear weapons. Never forgetting my friend Kristen, who grew up right next to the US nuclear test site and wanted to have babies so bad. 17 times she tried. 17 failures in miscarriage or stillbirth. 17 reasons to become a school teacher, which is what she wound up doing. Never forget these people in the conversation about nuclear weapons, because the human is what connects us, and the human is what drives us. And this is how we have changed the dynamic. And we've changed it significantly. We have this treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and it is radical. It's radical because it doesn't only prohibit nuclear weapons, although it does that. It also prohibits the threat to use nuclear weapons. It prohibits the provision of assistance in building nuclear weapons. And it requires every country that signs up to this treaty to help those people who have been harmed by nuclear weapons use and testing, even in the past. This is important because this treaty creates legal obligations around things that deterrence proponents and deterrence theory suggests are values. And instead we have legal prohibitions on them. And the point of deterrence is a credible threat. But this treaty, the Nuclear Ban Treaty, says not only is that threat not something that is legitimate, it is not something that is legal. As of today, 99 countries have signed or ratified this treaty, and not the nuclear-armed states or some of their friends, as I mentioned earlier. In fact, they've been mostly opposed to it. They argue fiercely about it, to the point that Emmanuel Macron tweets about how ineffective this treaty is at least once a year. I mean, his public relations people are obviously feeling some pressure if they're willing to step up and say something about it. And it's not as a result of like letters or things towards him. He's just actively arguing against this. The treaty lives in his head rent-free. Pretty happy about that. But 99 countries have said we do not consent to our own citizens being put at risk by nuclear weapons, which they are. And they're using the law to say so. So now I want to go to just a few things I'd like you to leave here with today, because I think I'm most likely way over time. First, the situation right now is not great, all right? Like, we're in a dangerous time. I've been working on this issue since the 1990s. It is the most dangerous I have ever seen. I was the last class in my public school in New York City to do duck and cover drills. And now we're being issued warnings about 3 days preparation materials we need to keep at home in the Netherlands. I need to have a 3-day water supply on hand. My son comes home from school terrified that the Russians are going to attack us. The situation is bad. But the risks, while they're high, we also know from the last few years that the interconnected world in which we live is so much more important than we had previously thought. If COVID taught us nothing else, it taught us that it matters what happens in places that we don't think about. Second, although the situation is bad, the discourse, how we talk about it, it matters. The images, the language, the questions that are legitimate, none of that is neutral. It's constructed. It serves interests. And when we recognize that, when we talk about that, we start to shift the balance. And we begin more critical thinking about nuclear weapons. The third thing is deterrence is not science. It is not fact. It's a script. It provides a psychological security and a sense of control in the face of radical uncertainty. And that is not nothing. People want to feel safe and have a legitimate right to feel safe, but it should not and cannot be confused with verified knowledge. And it cannot be immune to democratic scrutiny. And finally, change is possible. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, it exists. It's one of those things where they said, you're never going to do this, and we did it anyway. And we're working closely with governments around the world to challenge the nuclear-armed states, to demand that they and their friends stop putting us at risk. Thousands of parliamentarians around the world have supported this treaty. Mayors from hundreds of cities, more than 100 cities here in Spain, in fact, have demanded that the governments join. See, this magic can be named, and when we name it, it starts to lose its power. And I want to remind you, everybody here it's okay for you to talk about nuclear weapons. Like, people worry that they can't, that they're not expert enough, right? And I don't want you to think that. I want you to leave here and remember, wait, I can think about this. I can talk about this. It affects me. I have a right to do it. So I referenced a lot of different literature in this talk. And I also put our QR code for our website. So if you want to follow the issue or get in touch, that's a way to do it. And I'll just leave you with a thought. Every major shift in moral history, from the abolition of slavery to civil rights to environmental protection, happened not only in law, but by culture. It happened in images, in stories, in shared imagination, and in hope. And I believe nuclear disarmament will be no different, because the responsibility for abolishing these weapons does not lie only with governments. It lies with cities, institutions, financial systems, classrooms, and cool spaces like this one. And the future of disarmament will be decided in the public, through culture and through courage, and through the persistent refusal to accept that the threat of annihilation is normal, because it is not normal. We can decide our future, and we will. Thank you.
Thank you, Susi. Crec que ha sigut una sessió inspiradora, no? Tenim cert poder, segons sembla, sobretot si ens ho creiem. A partir d'aquí, si volem fer alguna pregunta, el que no sé és... Jo he de... Podeu fer la pregunta en català, ella té l'aparell, amb la qual no hi ha problema. Una pregunta allà. Reunim més d'una? N'hi ha alguna més? No sembla.
Hello, thanks for coming. I would like to ask, because I like the exposition, but I feel that it was treated by a imperialism point of view in certain terms, because I'm pretty sure that we all think that the nuclear weapons are bad, but in practice, in the geopolitical world of 2026, we have a war order where any country that wanted to come out from this, that wanted to go against the United States, will be invaded or will be submitted to economic blockage and things. So I would like to know what would you tell to other countries where they feel that their one hope is having nuclear weapons? Because, for example, I'm pretty sure that if Venezuela had nuclear weapons, Donald Trump wouldn't go and kidnap the president Nicolas Maduro, or why Donald Trump don't go to Pyongyang to take out Kim Jong-un. That's because he has nuclear weapons. I'm not saying that I like nuclear weapons, but I understand that there are countries and contexts where there's no other choice to have a real sovereignty and to preserve their country. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I think it is a very difficult situation, and it is very easy to think, oh yeah, you know, this ridiculous and absolute tragedy and violation of international law, which we see Donald Trump doing, which we've seen others do in the last couple of years, wouldn't be a problem for countries that have nuclear weapons. But that's why countries that don't have nuclear weapons, they work together, right? So Venezuela is bound not only by the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, so that it won't have them, but also by the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And if Venezuela wanted or had, I mean, Venezuela is also restricted by the Treaty of Tlatelolco. Like, since the 1970s, Venezuela has committed never to have nuclear weapons. Donald Trump's actions in invading, or not invading exactly, but earlier this year, is something that needs to be taken to the International Criminal Court, right? To the International Court of Justice. That is where we settle issues. And, you know, the idea that countries that have nuclear weapons will not be invaded or subject to, or that were subject to US economic challenges it's not fully the story, right? So we see since 1987, we've seen massive economic pressure put on North Korea. That was resolved in 1994 through a mutually agreed framework that the United States violated and led to North Korea's leaving of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2002, and the subsequent development and testing of nuclear weapons. The desire to not invade North Korea is, I think, attributable to more than whether or not they have nuclear weapons. It's also looking at the balance of power within the region, right? So China's role there is significant. Russia's role there is significant. And that's the both challenge and opportunity in all of these situations, is that no one, with the exception, well, not even Trump, operates alone any longer. And it's a huge change from what we have seen. So in Northeast Asia, North Korea remains a problem. South Korea is near nuclear, like their nuclear development's also a huge challenge. But North Korea is, as much as it may be nearly isolated, it's not completely isolated, and others will come to their defense. Nuclear weapons are part, but not the whole picture. What we see, you know, we see time and time again that countries who have had nuclear weapons and do have nuclear weapons, they're involved in more conflict than those who do not have nuclear weapons. And statistically, you know, if you look at all but China, every other nuclear-armed country has been involved in a conflict since it had its nuclear arms. And some have been involved in a conflict since their very inception, for most of their existence. So I hear you, and I hear that, you know, this idea that, you know, perhaps nuclear weapons are the way to defend against the United States, and the economic and military threats the United States poses. But countries like Austria, who are actively challenging the US, countries like Switzerland, who are Italy, who refuse access to the US for their wars of aggression, countries like France even, who stand up to the US, do not necessarily have these same issues. And aside from France, don't have their own nuclear weapons. So I think it's you could say that, but I think we have to look a little bit deeper into the story than to say if Iran didn't have if Iran had nuclear weapons, then they wouldn't have been attacked by Israel and the US. I don't think that's the case. There's a lot more going on. Thanks.
Algú més? No tenim gaire més temps per això. Si hi ha alguna pregunta, fem una i crec que ja està, perquè ara a les 7 s'ha de fer. Recordeu que hi ha la pregària de guerra aquí fora. Perdó? Ahir s'han de tornar els aparells aquests, òbviament. Per tant, si no hi ha cap més paraula, que no sembla que n'hi hagi, podem donar la sessió per acabada, agraint-li a la Susi. Thank you very much for your attendance.